Hi, Cliff Bray here. I'm building this T34 tank model. This is a Russian tank that was very widely used during World War II. There is the box that the tank model came in. I'm just about through putting the entire model together. There are the wheels right there. I just got through painting them black, and I will paint the hubs there green here in a little bit. There are the tank tracks, and I've started to prepare them with a flat black color. But what I plan to do with this tank is to weather it, to make it look like it's been through a couple of winters there in Russia. It's been out of the factory for a couple of years. The artist's depiction shows the tank in a very neat, clean fashion, which is what it may have looked like when it first came out of the factory. But after spending a few years in combat, it would be greatly chipped up and marred and scraped and rusted and dented. And so I'm going to put some of those effects on there. I also have added this white styrene rod in different places around the tank. And after I glue that rod on, I take a razor knife and cut it up, and it simulates what a weld would look like. And when you add rust to those welds, it's a very good weathering technique. But the technique I want to go over right now is a technique of adding an effect like there is a bubbling of the paint due to rust underneath the paint. And I've started to do that on the bottom of the turret there. The way I do that is I take liquid cement and apply it to the surface of the plastic where I want to have that effect. I let it sit for about 60 seconds and then take toothpicks, and using pressure with the pointed end of the toothpick, I punch kind of like little tiny dents into the plastic, which has been softened by the glue. And that should simulate the metal has started to deteriorate underneath the paint, and therefore has kind of that, pitted look and cracked look. I will do that technique on this fuel tank here on the back corner of the tank, and I'll use the top corner there. You can see right now it's very smooth and clean, like it just came out of the factory, but we're going to rough it up some along the edges to make it look like it's starting to rust. The surface of it is starting to rust and the paint is starting to come out, and that glue is what I will use to apply that technique. So let me go ahead and do that, and I'll be right back and show you the results. All done, roughing up the corner of this fuel tank in the back of the T34. I'll zoom in and you can see the effect. And again, what I did was I applied this liquid cement to the surfaces that I wanted to apply that effect to. Let it sit for about 45 to 60 seconds. And then using these toothpicks, I just apply pressure numerous times, maybe like 500 times, all through that area of glue. And that produced two effects. One, kind of a pitted look, where the points of the toothpick would put an impression into the softened plastic, but it also kind of produces this layered look, like if the paint has started to bubble up and start to come apart due to the rust underneath the paint. To help that effect, when I paint the entire tank, what I plan to do is use this hull red, as they did in the factory before applying the green color. So I'm going to combine this olive green and this dark green to produce a shade that will be similar to the color of the T34 when it came out of the factory. But underneath that will be this red primer. So when I start chipping and scratching and denting and kind of rusting up the tank, that red primer will be underneath there, as it would be in real life. The other thing I plan to do with this particular model is to make it look like the crews have used a whitewash material to camouflage the tank. When it would snow, a green tank like this would stand out against the snow-covered landscape, and so the crews would use a whitewash material and mops to make their tank blend in more with the white snow background. And so they would apply that whitewash all over the tank, kind of messy method, but nevertheless was very effective. But I want to try to simulate that kind of a look also. And not that they just applied it, but it had been applied actually maybe several times during the winter, and it had added to the rust and the chipping and the scrapes that are on the tank, and it started to come off a little bit also, perhaps. So let me go ahead and finish putting on the red primer, and then I'll be back with you. I have finished painting the tank with that whole red, and you can take a look at this corner of this fuel tank and see the effect now looks a little bit more realistic as far as it kind of a bubbling up effect and pitted effect, much like the bottom of the turret there as well. I also did that effect around the gun here and the weld that was holding that gun housing onto the main body of the tank. The Russians were not real precise in their welds. They did just whatever it took to weld a piece together, such as here in the front of the tank. You can see how irregular that weld is that I put on there. Because they were putting these T34s together very quickly and just really weren't that worried about making it look real pretty. Unlike the Germans who spent a lot of time on their welds and made sure they were very precise and uniform. But the Russians knew that most of these tanks were not going to last more than a few months in combat. And so they just really didn't see a need to spend that much time doing perfect welds on the outsides of them. And they were in a hurry too, because they had a timeline to meet in order to be able to successfully field enough T-34s to fight the war. So next step is going to be to paint the entire tank with this kind of an olive green color there, a little bit lighter than olive drab, more of a green color there, which will be true to the colors that the Russians used. Before I put that paint on, though, I will give the entire tank a light coat of hairspray as part of the hairspray chipping technique that you can read about or see in other YouTube videos, because I will be weathering this tank and chipping it up and that hairspray coat on there before I put the outer coat of green paint will help that chipping effect once I begin. So let me go ahead and paint the tank green, and I'll be back. I have finished painting the tank green. As I had mentioned earlier, I gave it a light coat of hairspray before applying this green paint, and that will facilitate the chipping and weathering process that I'll be doing next. This fuel tank on the back of the T-34 that I had roughened up and pitted using the glue, and the toothpick is looking pretty good, as are the other parts that were roughed up. And they'll look even better after I apply some rust stains and other weathering techniques to those areas. Yeah. So what I'm going to do now is use this kind of a little short bristle brush and a kind of a little bit of a regular paintbrush and that bamboo skewer there, and apply some water using those three things to parts of the tank to kind of scratch them up and chip them up. And as I do that, that water will make its way down through the top coat of the paint into the hairspray and kind of help dissolve away the green paint and exposing that red primer underneath, much as it would in real life. So let me get started on that, and I'll be back. I have finished with the preliminary weathering of the tank and added a lot of chipping and scratches and dents, and bent some of the hand rails. Also added the rust effects throughout the tank. You can see how this rust effect that I was experimenting with came out pretty good, where I was trying to make it look like at the bottom of the turret there, that there was rust starting underneath the paint. It is just chipped away, peeled off the paint, and the rust is deforming the metal there. Yeah, same thing. You remember this back fuel tank here. Let me zoom in to simulate rust on this corner. And the paint, of course, is pretty much all peeled off there. Same thing with that fender. And I added some rust to the wheels. The front of the tank is looking pretty good. You can see the weld that I had put on around the machine gun enclosure there. These other welds. This one up front, I think I told you in the last segment that the Russians did not want to spend a lot of time on these welds, and so they were very rough looking, and that's what I tried to simulate with that weld up front. The fenders have come out pretty good. Again, I used that liquid glue to soften up the plastic. And I think it simulates very well what metal looks like when rust gets underneath it and the paint starts to peel off because of the rusting underneath the paint. But that's not metal. That's plastic there, of course. Yeah. So what I'm going to do now is I'm experimenting with the whitewash that the crews applied with mops during World War II to camouflage the tanks during snowy seasons. And they applied that very sloppily with mops, buckets, and I'm trying to simulate that look. They weren't trying to paint the tank white. They were just trying to make it blend in with the snow. So that's what I'm trying to simulate there as best I can, just looking at just the very few photos that exist of some of these. And of course, a lot of them are black and white. But I'm simulating that the whitewash was put on several weeks ago and it started to rub off and wash off due to rain, and that the rust that was already on the tank, throughout the tank, is now starting to show through that whitewash as well, see? And I'll keep experimenting with that and trying to make it as realistically looking as possible. But that's the next step. So when I get back with you, I'll have that whitewash on the tank, and we'll be putting the treads on. I have finished weathering those and muddying those up like they've been operating on the Russian soil there for several weeks and months, and are very dirty and have not been cleaned in quite a while. And I'm working on the cables and rusting them up. This little shovel here. So I'll get the whitewash put on there, and I'll be back in the next segment. So here's the completed T34. I have applied the winter whitewash, simulating what the crews did in World War II to camouflage their tanks during the winter months when there was a lot of snow on the ground. Again, what I'm trying to simulate here is that the crew applied the whitewash several weeks ago, and since that time, the rain and the crew climbing all over the tank has rubbed off and scratched off an awful lot of the whitewash. but some of it still remains. And this is pretty true to a lot of the photographs that I have seen of these T34s that had the whitewash applied to them, and then several weeks had gone by and the whitewash had started to come off. I used three different types of paint to get the effects you see there. The first was this X2 white. And what I did was I just applied a very light coat of that on the entire tank top surfaces and the turret, and then came back and rubbed off with a brush and a rag a lot of it to expose some of the green that was underneath the whitewash, which is simulating a lot of the way it looks in the photographs, with a lot more of it rubbed off here in the back of the tank. In fact, these fuel tanks, it's just about all off, because those would have been filled up maybe several times, and the fuel would have maybe flowed out over the top of them and washed away some of that whitewash. Yeah. The second type paint that I used was this titanium white oil paint. I used that diluted pretty heavily with some mineral spirits to make some more solid white areas where the whitewash was a little bit thicker when it was applied, and it's still on the tank. The third type of paint that I used is this titanium dioxide pigment powder, and I diluted that with water, and I would use it in areas to simulate the effect of the whitewash running down the vertical surfaces of the tank and collecting in areas such as that little area there below the turret, and where it would be protected from the crew stepping on it and wearing it out, or the water maybe washing it away, or maybe the water would wash even more whitewash into those areas, and it would pool and become a more solid white. So again, three different types of white paint to get these effects in the different tones of white. I think the pitting effect that I used with that glue to soften up the plastic, and then that toothpick to make those little pitted holes, came out very good, simulating like rust coming through the factory green paint and chipping it away. Same thing over here on the other side of the tank. I think it came out very good, and that's the first time I've used that effect. And I already showed you the fuel tanks here, all rusted up and chipped and pitted with that technique. Yeah. The crews did not whitewash the tracks of the tank because they knew that it was wintertime and there was snow and slush, and the whitewash was not paint, so it would come off very quickly on these lower areas. And they were worried more about camouflaging the top part of the tank that was sticking up and more exposed to view. The T-34 was the most mass-produced tank in all of World War II. Some 80,000 T-34s were created during the war. It kind of had its debut during Operation Barbarossa, when the Germans invaded Russia in 1941. And the Germans were kind of surprised by the T-34 because it had this sloped armor, both on the sides and in the front. And many of the German shells were kind of glancing off of that sloped armor. Since that time, almost all tanks have adopted the sloped armor, but the T-34 was one of the first tanks to use it. Although it was the most produced tank of World War II, it also was the tank model that suffered the most losses. Some 40,000 T-34s were destroyed in combat. And of course, many of those crews in those 40,000 tanks were killed as well. when the tank was destroyed. But it was the main battle tank for Russia, and it certainly held its own up until the time when the German Tiger tank and German Panther tank came out. And it's considered one of the major historic tanks in the world. So hopefully this video helped you out as you might embark on weathering a tank with whitewash yourself.